Have you ever wondered how crime and violence are dealt with, or was dealt with, hundreds of years ago? Hello, everybody. My name is Paul French, and today we're exploring crime and violence throughout history. So, from medieval trials to Victorian order, let's have a bit of a light look at how our ancestors tackled these issues. Before we delve any deeper, here are two perhaps little-known facts about crime and history. The first is that in medieval Europe, trial by ordeal was quite commonplace. So the accused criminals might have been made to hold a red-hot iron or retrieve a stone from boiling water to prove their innocence. I don't get the logic behind it either, but apparently there must have been some. So if their wounds healed cleanly, for example, then they were considered innocent by divine intervention. Another fact is that in the 19th century, or during the 19th century, the Metropolitan Police in London, known as, the bobbies or peelers, would often patrol without weapons, and their primary tool for maintaining order was their, can you guess it? Their whistle. Yes, absolutely, most powerful tool they had, which they often used to call for backup. Now, let's get to the particulars of this video on crime and violence throughout at least a couple of examples throughout, or rather in the historical context. So understanding this helps us to see how current justice systems have evolved and how they have come to be where they are today. One of the first points I'm going to pick up on is the relationship between crime and punishment, because it's important to note that the relationship between crime and punishment, it isn't as straightforward as one might think. The severity of punishment didn't always correlate directly with the crime or crime rates. For example, during the 18th century, England saw a significant decline in homicide rates, but an increase in prosecutions for property crimes. So what we need to remember here is that punishment is an expression of violence. It's an expression of state-sanctioned violence. So one of the things that we try and do in criminology, or one of the things that I try and teach my students quite early on in their degrees, is that violence, or their perceptions or their definition of that word, needs to evolve beyond this mere conception of violence being, what we might stereotypically think of, maybe one person striking another, for example. We need to move beyond that right off the bat and consider a broader interpretation of what violence means and the forms in which it can come. So when we talk about violence in the sense of punishment, I'm not alone in academic circles in describing and talking about violence in the form of the prescription of punishment. So it is important to note that this relationship between crime and punishment, it isn't straightforward. And again, the severity of punishment way back when didn't always correlate directly with the crime or crime rates. And like most things, with time, as enough time passes, the perceptions of crime and criminality changed as well. So perceptions of crime, they have shifted rather dramatically over time. In the 17th century, for example, crime was often viewed through a religious lens. It was often seen as a sin. People who, particularly those who committed the most gravest of crimes, murder and what have you, their behaviors were often rationalized as demonic. This person must have been possessed by some demonic force. No rational person could have committed such a crime. That was the kind of logic that we're dealing with. The Enlightenment period kind of changed quite a bit of that. And by the 19th century, this sort of evolution of thought shifted to be more secular, and it's focused quite a bit more as well on property crimes and the use of punishment and, by extension, violence as a way of maintaining social order. So what I mean there is that if we think about, or try and imagine, the Middle to Dark Ages, where it was probably as close to anarchy as we've had in terms of human civilization, quite a long time. So in Britain, we would have had a social structure that would have resembled more clans and families looking after their own. There wasn't much of a centralized system. And how conflicts were addressed and settled was through the expression, more often than not, the expression of violence. So if one family member insulted or assaulted or basically committed a crime on another clan or the member of another family, then violence was often the answer. But as we civilized and as we developed coexistence once more with each other, we couldn't maintain this expression of violence as a way of conflict resolution. There needed to be that centralized system. And with that, then, this centralized system, i.e. the criminal justice system, and by extension, governmental powers who, make and pass law, they then had to take sole ownership of the use of violence through punishment for wrongdoing. My ability now to go out and express violence against someone I might not like is, well, one, a crime, and even if it is in retaliation for a crime that I've experienced by them, that is not justifiable enough, and can be, well, it's a crime in and of itself, but it can also, we've got vigilantism, for example. So we don't have an ownership of violence at a sort of civilian level, not anymore, not for a long time. So the state, for example, the state has taken ownership of that. And one point, just before we kind of push towards the end, is the role of statistics. So interpreting historical crime data is rather challenging. For example, before the 19th century, official crime statistics were almost non-existent. And historians now often rely on things like court records, but these can be incomplete and sometimes misleading. For example, Victorian England saw a decline in recorded violent crimes, but this might be due to changes in policing or changes in legal definitions rather than the reality of the crime rates themselves. So my point is that from a criminological perspective, as a researcher, trying to measure crime rates today against historical records is quite difficult to do, and should be done so really with a sort of basically with a pinch of salt on some of the records and some of the data that we draw from a couple hundred years ago, for example. They might indicate something, but they're largely going to be fraught with a whole bunch of issues. Basically, to sum up, the link between crime rates and punishment severity, it can be complex, and it can be influenced by a whole abundance of factors. And our understanding of crime has shifted from being one which was steeped in religious morality and religious sentiment to a focus on social order and definitely property protection. And those historical crime statistics, when trying to measure and compare violence, they are requiring careful interpretation, as they can be incomplete and even bias as well, by those who would have recorded them. Even now, I suppose, you get current governments who manipulate crime statistics. But either way, look, if you found today's discussion on crime and violence interesting, please do like, share, and subscribe for future content. Thank you guys for watching. My name is Paul French, and I will see you again next time.